Hello, America, and welcome to the seventh episode of the American Restraint podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Trepanier, and I'm excited to continue on this journey with you. Okay, before we get going, just a little recap for those of you who are new to the show. This is a podcast about how to fix America. It is largely based on my recent book, American Restraint. I believe the country is fundamentally divided, and that the forces of hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism are largely to blame. And the fix is federalism. As usual, I ask for your ratings, reviews, subscription, likes, comments, and sharing this podcast. It really helps get the word out about the show. Today, we're going to start talking about the fix part of how to fix America. I call this episode, I Heart Federalism. All right, let's go. So my book, American Restraint, has three parts. The first part, about why America is so broken, was answered when I read Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Trepanier. And here's a copy of this great book right here. We've talked about it a couple times on the show. The second part of my book, What is the Solution?, was answered when I learned about Article 5 and Convention of States. I had considered many different solutions for how to fix America. Elect better leaders, try a new political party, go back to the original intent of the Constitution, and other ideas. As we talked about on a previous episode, none of these status quo solutions will work because they don't address the structural root causes of hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism. By the way, we'll talk about the third part of my book in later episodes. During the COVID shutdown of 2020, I was reading a really interesting book by law professor Frank Buckley in 2020 entitled American Secession. So here's the book right here. Great book, highly recommended. As I watched the violent riots in cities across America, I wondered if America would enter another civil war. Professor Buckley did talk about another civil war and various secession movements in states like Idaho, Virginia, and California. But he was hopeful that there were less violent means for solving America's structural problems. It was in this book that I learned about Article 5 in the Constitution and the Convention of States movement. You see, I've always been a big fan of federalism. That's the type of government our founders set up in the Constitution, a federal republic. And I'd felt for a long time that Washington, D.C. had broken the balance of power between the federal government and state governments. They had completely ignored, for example, the 10th Amendment. And here's the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Pretty clear, huh? Yeah, but also pretty clearly ignored by DC. I went to conventionofstates.com to learn more. I read all the background material about the movement and how it was all grounded in Article 5 of the Constitution. It all made so much sense. The more I read, the more I discovered that this is the option for America. This is how to fix America. So a little bit more about Article 5 later in this episode. So America is broken, that much is clear. Our culture is broken, our economic system is broken, our national government is broken. More importantly, we need to realize that this undoing was inevitable due to the forces of hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism. America is truly at a crossroads. At this point in America's history, we have essentially two choices. We can continue voting for the same Democrats and Republicans who offer the same tired solutions to America's problems without addressing our key structural issues. We can urgently rethink how America is organized, while simultaneously addressing our key structural problems of hyper-capitalism and hyper-individualism. So what are those two options. Option 1 continues the status quo. Democrats tell their voters that if they're in power, they'll fix everything. Republicans promise the same illusion to their voters. And how has that approach been working for roughly the past 50 years? For the past few decades, roughly 80% of people continuously think that America's on the wrong track. Ultimately, option 1 cannot fix America because our problems are structural. Option 2 is our best hope. We urgently need to try to do something completely different. We need a paradigm shift. America's already too big, too corrupt, too wealthy, too divided, and too angry to function as it has for the past 200 plus years. We can't overcome our current crisis of brokenness because hyper-individualism and hyper-capitalism are too far spread across the country, like two deadly cancers. We also can't overcome our current crisis of brokenness because Washington, D.C. has too much concentrated power. All right, America, you know how we like to do things here on this podcast. Great 80s songs to highlight themes of the show. And this one, Freedom of Choice, is from one of my favorite bands of the 80s, Devo. Quick note about the name of the band Devo. The Spud Boys from Akron, Ohio, didn't believe in evolution. They believed if you look closely at the culture, what you actually see is de-evolution. They're not wrong, you know. Here's a few lines from the song. A victim of collision on the open sea, nobody ever said that life was free. Sink, swim, go down with the ship, but use your freedom of choice. I'll say it again, in the land of the free, use your freedom of choice, your freedom of choice. So, there are two choices, status quo or fix America. Okay, back to the show. I heart federalism. The federal government is the most rich and powerful government in the history of the world. It has also become too corrupt, ungovernable, and incapable of reforming itself. The 5 surrounding counties nearest to Washington, D.C. are some of the wealthiest counties in the entire country. Nearly constant scandals, regular mismanagement of the economy, and catastrophic war losses are the accomplishments of this generation of some of the worst leaders in America's history. All of this has resulted in a loss of faith in our institutions. A recent Gallup survey found that 16% of Americans say they trust the government to do what is right just about always or most of the time. 16%. This is compared to levels in the 70% range in the late 50s and 60s. Option 2 is our only hope. If 80% of the Americans don't think the country is on the right track, and they don't trust the federal government. Option 2 is the best option. And this solution to America's brokenness is found right in the U.S. Constitution. Article 5 of the Constitution should be option 2. Most Americans, however, are not very familiar with Article 5 of the Constitution. Most Americans are familiar generally with a few basic elements of the Constitution, and it's usually people who follow politics who are familiar with the amendment process. However, very few Americans know that in addition to Congress, the states can also propose amendments. So this is the text directly from Article 5. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. The Article 5 convention option is the best solution to addressing America's brokenness and the 80% of Americans who feel like the country is on the wrong track. Seriously, what do the 20% of Americans, why do they feel like this country is on the right track? Sorry, I don't get it. The Convention of States organization has a well thought out, constitutionally sound plan to bring about this convention. COS, as they are also known, is led by grassroots organizers, constitutional scholars, and seasoned politicians who have all come to the same conclusion. There is a 0% chance that DC will reform itself. Over roughly the past decade, COS has been making strong progress to follow the process outlined in Article 5 for proposing important constitutional amendments through the states rather than through Congress. In a little over a decade, COS has worked with all 50 state legislatures to pass a Convention of States resolution. As Article 5 states, it takes 2/3 or 34 states to call for an Article 5 convention. COS has made a lot of progress, having passed the COS resolution in 19 states, and they have active legislation in 20 more states. COS has even held 2 simulated conventions to show the country what an Article 5 convention might look like. You can go on YouTube and find these pretty easily. The COS resolution is very focused on a small number of proposals to limit the monopoly power of the federal government. The resolution calls for a convention that would only allow states to discuss amendments that limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, impose fiscal restraints, and place term limits on federal officials. One of the powerful things the COS movement has going for it is the focused limited scope to reduce most of the power concentrated in Washington, D.C., and return that power to the states and the people. A little history of recent amendments to the U.S. Constitution also highlight this curious fact. The last time the U.S. Congress proposed and helped ratify a major amendment, number 26, giving 18-year-olds the right to vote, was in 1971. This amendment was a response to many protests from young citizens who were understandably upset about being too young to vote, yet not too young to be drafted and killed in Vietnam. However, it has been over 50 years since the U.S. Congress has been willing to listen to its constituents and amend the Constitution. The institution and its members have no interest in restraining their power and authority, which is exactly why an Article 5 convention is the best hope for a broken, divided America. Former appeals court judge Malcolm Wilkie, after studying this issue, he put it this way: the performance of the federal government has become a great disappointment to most Americans. It is most unlikely that Congress, with its vested interest in the status quo, will ever pass the constitutional reforms necessary to address this disappointment. Therefore, the time has come for a second constitutional convention. The idea for calling an Article 5 convention has been seriously considered over the past few decades. Leading constitutional scholars who have written about the need for an Article 5 convention. In addition to these serious discussions of Article 5, the COS approach has been endorsed by many leading scholars and reform-minded political leaders. Among this group of influential thinkers include Dr. Kevin Roberts from the Heritage Foundation, Governor Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, Senator Rick Santorum, Governor Greg Abbott, Dr. James Dobson, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Senator Ben Sasse. And it's important to note that COS is also supported by over 2.6 million ordinary Americans who have signed its petition. Okay, so who then could be opposed to an Article 5 convention? In a nutshell, it's anyone who likes the status quo of an out-of-control, unaccountable federal government that only 15% of Americans trust to do the right thing. Among those 15% are progressive organizations like Common Cause, who have compiled lots of misleading information on their website about how dangerous an Article 5 convention would be. Groups like Common Cause are mainly against an Article 5 convention and a balanced budget, term limits, and a more restrained federal government because Common Cause likes big government. The best response for groups and individuals who are afraid of trying to improve our country comes from Professor Lubunsky in his book on the Article 5 Convention. He said, "The call for a second constitutional convention will generate strong opposition. Many people will think such an idea is not only naive but dangerous. But no matter how the critics explain their position, there can only be one argument against holding such a convention: that the American people cannot be trusted to participate in a national discussion about the political health of their nation." I want to repeat that last part because it's so important. That the American people cannot be trusted to participate in a national discussion about the political health of their nation. I disagree. I think that the American people can be trusted. I agree with Professor Lubunsky. Okay, that's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a little bit along the way about Article 5 of the Constitution and why I strongly believe that the Convention of States movement has the best plan to help fix our broken country and bring back federalism. I'd really encourage anyone listening or watching this episode to go to conventionofstates.com, read more about Article 5, and sign the petition to help us bring back federalism. All right, until next time, have a great day. Bye-bye.